Hi, it's Frank here. I'm going to be talking about modulation. Over the past few videos, I sort of set the stage for this by talking about things like key signatures and keys that are related, or how their relationships work with regard to relative, parallel, and closely related. So most of that is going to come into play as we get into modulation, and this will probably be the first of maybe two videos about it. When we talk about modulation, what we're specifically talking about is the movement from one key to the next, and that's established in different ways, of course, as you make up progressions or work within established ones. But the idea is that you are now actually in a new key. Let me back up. When we talked about secondary dominance recently, I talked about this idea of transient modulation. That is to say, the secondary dominants, which were either dominant seventh chords, dominant seventh chords, or diminished seventh chords, were used to imply a feeling that you were traveling towards something different, something new, something that was outside the native chords of a certain key, meaning the diatonic chords of a certain key. However, you didn't actually leave that key. That example I think I used around the time of that video specifically had us going from a C chord to a D as in dog 7 chord to a G7 chord back to C, which in the key of C works out to 1, 2, 5, 1 as far as the progression by root name. Now, even though the D as in dog 7 chord is not diatonic to the key of C, it worked in this context because it was a secondary dominant. What it did was intensify, or embellish if you prefer, the movement toward that G7 chord, which was of course diatonic. Because of that effect, in other words, using a dominant 7th version of D as instead of the minor chord, which would normally be in that key, we went ahead and called that a 5-7 of 5. It was heightening the movement towards the 5 chord, which ultimately then went back to 1. That means even though we changed the kind of chord we used, we kept within the same expected pattern of progression, 1, 2, 5, 1. And in that video, of course, I went over different ways you can use the secondary dominants to do that. That idea is tonicization, where we allude to another key. We touch on it, or perhaps even briefly flirt with it to the extent that we're momentarily in it. Tonicization is the word we use, with tonic being part of that root, to indicate that we're momentarily alluding to something else. There is a sense that we're moving toward or are briefly in. But modulation is where we actually commit to the new key. And we emphasize that commitment by shoring up the chords around the new key, making sure that they clearly point to a new tonic. So there you have tonicization, which works as a kind of transient modulation, and then modulation, which is fully committing to the new key. With that in mind, the PDF I attached to today's video there in the description is a short version of Yankee Doodle. It's just 8 measures long because that's long enough to get the point across for this first kind of modulation. Traditionally, there's 3 kinds that we talk about. There's so-called common chord, also known as pivot chord, chromatic modulation, and then direct modulation. Both the second and third of those, chromatic and the direct modulation, have enough overlap that we can kind of talk about those as one, and we'll do that in another video. Today I want to focus on pivot chord modulation. The example that I wrote out that's in there, linked in the description, actually uses that kind of modulation. Common chord, or pivot chord, relies on exactly that, a chord that is common or native to both the old key and the new key. Often that chord fulfills a so-called subdominant function, like a 2 or 4 would in the old and new key, but it doesn't have to. And the example that I have written out there, the chord that's going to connect between old and new keys is actually going to be the dominant chord for the old key, but the subdominant chord in the new key. However, it's diatonic to both. That's the most important aspect. So if we look at that PDF, which I have in front of me, I'll kind of go through. Again, if you want to look at it, feel free to click that link and download it. We have 2 phrases, a phrase being about 4 measures long and being part of what we call a statement. In this case, it's the opening statement, the first 4 measures that are replied to in the second 4 measures. So the first 4-measure phrase has us pretty firmly in the key of C, and we know that because of all the chords flying around. There's 1 chord, a 6 chord, and a 5 chord. Specifically, we start out on the 1 chord, move to the 5 chord in second inversion, then move to the 6 chord, before coming back to the 5 chord in root position. Again, all diatonic there. For the last 2 measures of this first phrase, we go to an F chord, the 4 chord, subdominant chord in this key. And then we insert a secondary dominant. In this case, it's E7, before moving back to the A minor chord, and then coming to rest in what we call a half cadence. That that is to say the last chord in the first four measures is G, the 5 chord. Now it's worth pointing out that the reason why that A minor is there is to momentarily take your ear away from the C major. Of course, A minor is the relative minor of C, so there's an easy opportunity to present that as a possible transition point. I heighten that effect in the second to last of those first four measures, the third measure, by using an F to E7 combination. That kind of so-called turnaround is quite common if you're looking at a minor blues, where you have a dominant chord, a tonic chord, and you move to a subdominant, which is also minor, come back to a tonic, that's of course minor, and then move to the flat 6, which would be the submediant chord that's flatted, that then goes to dominant, which would be major also. Both of those chords, the flat 6 and the 5 in this case, would be major chords that help push your ear back toward the minor tonic chord. And that's what I set up as I move from measures 3 to 4. So twice in the first phrase of this little short excerpt, I use A minor chord to momentarily push your ear to something different. And I heighten that effect, I help tonicize it by using the F to E7 movement I just described. When I get to the G chord, though, at the end of the first four measures, it's pretty straightforward sounding in the sense that it sounds like I'm getting ready to go back to probably the C. That's because of having started on a C chord and worked my way toward the dominant chord that particular half of the song, the phrase, ends with. Since, as I said earlier, though, that G chord is also the subdominant chord in the key of D as in dog major, I use that as an opportunity to smoothly transition into that key, beginning with the second phrase, which keeps the melody but transposes it up a step. So there we begin and end the second phrase in D as in dog major. Now that is not a closely related key, because if it was D was the tonic and we want it to be closely related, it would have to be D as in dog minor. It's also not the parallel minor, because of course C minor is parallel to C major. It's not related by major minor in the sense that A minor is. Relative major for A minor is C, and major for C major to minor is A minor. So to be clear, the D is a new key entirely. It's easy to check that by just looking at the key signature. Normally D would have 2 sharps, C has none. Remember that when we talk about closely related key, it can have usually only one additional sharp or flat, either added or missing, when we're looking at whether or not something's closely related. So D is a new key. Why did I choose D? Because I wanted to move the melody up a step. I transposed it up 2 frets, a step, and to do that, that put me in the key of D as in dog. So then I had to take a step back and say, well, how do I pivot into that with a chord that is going to smoothly connect old key and new key? That's where the common chord modulation occurs. That G chord at the end of the first phrase allows me to use a chord that's going to be native to both keys. And it's significant that it's at the end of the first phrase, the first 4 measures. Most modulations do occur at the end of a phrase. It doesn't always occur at the end of a phrase, and a modulation doesn't have to always occur at the end of a phrase. There are always examples of not doing that, but it is most common throughout Western music, both older and more contemporary, to see it at the end of a certain phrase that's anywhere from 4 or at most 8 measures long. And in this case, one way to do that is the pivot chord, the G chord. So once again, the idea here was that I used the same melody that I did in the original key, but I just transposed it up a step. And then to accommodate that, I went ahead and used chords in a new key, and I allowed myself to transition to those chords by using a chord that was common to both keys, a so-called pivot chord. That is common chord modulation in a nutshell. Download the PDF. You'll have a chance to see everything that I just talked about. I've also included the Roman numerals and how I would analyze that, as well as the common chord names, including some of the passing chords, which were slash chords. The melodies in red even, to make sure everything's nice and clear and easy to understand. In the next video I will go ahead and talk about probably the combination of both chromatic and direct modulation, which also occurs quite a bit in music, certainly in popular music. And we'll see how that contrasts a little bit with the idea of using the common chord or pivot chord modulation. Take care.